The flowers arrived before she did. That was how Wren found out her fiancé had been sleeping with someone else. Not from a confession, not from a text message left open on the counter, but from a bouquet of white gardenias delivered to the wrong address. The card read, "For my real bride. Tonight changes everything. E." She stood in the hallway of the Callaway Grand Hotel in her ivory dress, holding someone else's flowers, and understood that the last 4 years of her life had been a ledger with a false bottom. Ethan had always known she was good with numbers. He just didn't know she'd eventually count all the ones that didn't add up. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 o'clock. The wrong flowers arrived at 2:47. Wren had 13 minutes to decide what kind of woman she was going to be. The kind who walked down that aisle anyway and pretended she hadn't seen what she'd seen, or the kind who was going to make him stand at the altar long enough to sweat through his shirt. She chose neither. She was still standing in the hallway, shoes in one hand and the stranger's flower card in the other, when the elevator opened and a man walked out who made every single person in that corridor go quiet without saying a word. He wasn't the tallest man she'd ever seen. He wasn't even the most conventionally intimidating, though the scar that ran from his left jaw to just below his ear did most of that work for him. What stopped people in their tracks was something harder to name. It was the way he moved through space as if he'd already calculated every exit and decided none of them were necessary. The way his dark eyes swept the hallway and landed on her in the time it took most people to blink. He was wearing a charcoal suit, no tie, a watch that probably cost more than her mother's house. His hands were at his sides, and on his right hand, across the knuckles, was a tattoo she couldn't read from this distance. But she got the sense it wasn't decorative. He looked at her the way people look at things they find unexpectedly interesting. "You're not going in," he said. It wasn't a question. Wren looked down at her shoes, then at the card, then back at him. "I haven't decided yet." "Yes, you have." She should have walked away. She knew that. Everything rational in her, every carefully organized thought she'd ever had, told her to find a side stairwell and figure out her next move in private. Instead, she heard herself say, "What makes you so sure?" He looked at the card in her hand. "Because you're still reading it." His name, she would learn later, was Kelner. Just Kelner, the way certain men shed their first names, the way others shed conscience, quietly and without looking back. He was there because the wedding venue was owned by a business associate of his, and he had come to collect something that had nothing to do with Wren. But life, as Wren had learned from years of correcting other people's accounting errors, rarely unfolds according to the plan on paper. She told him about the flowers. She didn't mean to. It came out the way things do when you've been holding them for 13 minutes, and suddenly someone is standing in front of you, asking the right question. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known him?" 4 years, and you did his books." It wasn't a question either. She looked at him sharply. "How did you?" "Your hands," he said. "You count things. You were counting syllables when you were deciding whether to tell me that." Wren stared at him. "I wasn't. You were." He wasn't unkind about it. He said it the way you'd say the sky is grey, as a simple piece of observable data. "What did you find?" She didn't answer right away, because the truth was, she had found something 3 months ago. A series of transfers from the events company Ethan co-owned, routed through 2 shell accounts and landing, eventually, in a personal account she'd never seen before. She had told herself it was probably nothing. She was good at telling herself that. It was the one skill she'd developed specifically so she could keep loving him without the math getting in the way. "Nothing that matters anymore," she said. Kelner studied her face. "It matters. You just don't want it to." She didn't go to the ceremony. What she did instead was walk with a stranger to the hotel bar on the 4th floor, still in her wedding dress, shoes now back on her feet, because she wasn't about to sit on a bar stool in her stockings in front of a man like this. She ordered a club soda. He ordered nothing. He sat across from her like someone who had nowhere to be and had simply decided to be here. "He's going to come looking for you," Kelner said. "Let him." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, she didn't think this man did softness, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. "You have somewhere to go?" he asked. She laughed, and it came out smaller than she intended. "I have a lease that ends in 6 weeks, and a job offer in a city where I don't know anyone, because Ethan thought it would be better if we lived somewhere closer to his family after the wedding." She turned the glass in her hands. "His family that apparently includes a woman I didn't know existed." Kelner was quiet. Then, "The job offer is still good? Probably. I haven't accepted it yet, because I was going to." She stopped. "It doesn't matter. Wren." She looked up. He'd used her name. She hadn't told him her name. He must have read her expression, because he said, "It's on the seating card outside the ceremony room. They have them on easels." Of course they did. She'd made those seating cards herself. She'd spent an entire Sunday evening hand-lettering 47 names in a font she'd taught herself from a YouTube tutorial, and the 48th name had been her own. "I have a proposition," Kelner said. He said it the same way he'd said everything else. Flat, unhurried, without any of the performance she might have expected from someone about to say something unreasonable. "I need a comptroller. Someone who can manage accounts that require discretion." The last 2 people who held the position either quit or made the mistake of thinking they could skim from the margins. Wren set down her glass. "What kind of accounts?" "The kind that don't go to the IRS." She should have stood up. She was aware, in the clear and analytical part of her brain that never fully went offline, that she was sitting in a hotel bar in a wedding dress, talking to a man she'd known for less than an hour, who had just implied he ran money that the federal government didn't know about. She was aware that this was, by any reasonable metric, the wrong direction. "And if I say no," she asked, "then you say no." He spread his hands, an oddly open gesture. "I'm not in the habit of forcing useful people to work for me. It's inefficient." Wren looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. He didn't try to fill the silence, which was either the most calculated or the most honest thing about him. She couldn't tell which yet. "I have conditions," she said finally. A pause. Then, almost imperceptibly, "Name them. A salary. A real one, not cash in envelopes. Something I can document. Done. A place to live for the first 60 days. After that I find my own. Done. And if I find something wrong in the books, something that shouldn't be there, I'm not covering it up. I'll tell you. But I'm not taking the fall for it either." He was quiet long enough that she wondered if she'd miscalculated. Then he said, "You're the first person to ask for that. What did the others ask for? More money. Mostly, and then they skimmed." "Yes." She picked up her glass again. "How long?" 1 year. After that, if you want to leave, you leave. No complications." She thought about the apartment. The lease. The job offer sitting in her inbox that she hadn't answered because she'd been so sure she was about to build a different kind of life. She thought about Ethan standing at the altar right now, probably wondering where she was. Probably not, actually. Probably checking his phone. "I want it in writing," she said. "All of it. Duration, salary, the exit clause." Something that might, under very specific lighting, have been respect crossed Kelner's face. "Tonight," he said. She finished her club soda. The ice had melted. She could hear faintly the sounds of a string quartet starting up somewhere below them. The ceremony was beginning. Someone was walking down an aisle toward the wrong man, or no one was walking at all and the guests were beginning to murmur. She thought about those 47 seating cards. She thought about the Gardenia card still in her clutch. She thought about 3 months of looking at numbers and choosing not to see them. She set the glass down. "Okay," she said. 1 year. The house was in an area of the city that didn't show up on real estate listings because no one in that neighborhood was selling anything. It sat behind a gate that looked old and decorative until you noticed the camera mounted in the ironwork, and past the gate was a driveway that curved, and past the driveway was a building that someone had at some point called a house, the way someone might call a surgical instrument a kitchen knife. Technically accurate, functionally absurd. Wren's room was on the 3rd floor. It had a window seat and 2 deadbolts and its own bathroom, and nothing personal belonging to anyone. It was the cleanest, most aggressively neutral space she had ever slept in. She didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, still in the wedding dress, because she hadn't thought to bring anything else, and hadn't wanted to ask, and she ran the numbers, the ones she'd seen 3 months ago. The transfers, the accounts, the amounts. She ran them the way she always ran numbers she was worried about, methodically, starting from the end and working backward, looking for the place where the story changed. By 4 in the morning, she had a figure. By 4:15 she understood what Ethan had been doing and approximately how long he'd been doing it. She was calmer than she expected to be. The dress was ruined. She'd sat on it wrong, and the back panel was creased beyond recovery. And she was sitting alone in a house that belonged to a man whose last name was probably not a coincidence, and the person she had spent 4 years building a life with had been dismantling that life for at least 18 months, and she was calm. She decided that meant either she was more practical than she'd thought, or the part of her that needed to fall apart had simply decided to file the paperwork and wait. She fell asleep eventually, still in the dress, sitting up against the headboard. In the morning, a woman named Orina knocked on the door and left a change of clothes on the floor outside. Jeans, a grey sweater, clean socks, without any explanation or ceremony, which Wren appreciated more than she could say. She changed. She went downstairs. She found a kitchen and coffee and a small desk in what appeared to be an office off the main hall, and on the desk there was a folder. Inside the folder, a contract. 1 year. Salary. She blinked at the number, then read it again, then accepted it, because the work was going to be exactly as complicated as she suspected, and the pay should reflect that. Exit clause, clearly worded. At the end of the term, she was free to go. Full stop. No non-compete, no extended obligation. A confidentiality agreement that was thorough but not punitive. At the bottom, a line for her signature. At the bottom of that, already signed, Kelner. She read the whole thing twice. Then she found a pen in the desk drawer and signed her name. She'd always had neat handwriting. She'd gotten that from her mother, who kept all her own accounts in careful columns in a composition notebook, because she didn't trust computers and didn't trust banks, and as it turned out had been right to distrust both. Wren Calloway, her mother's name, not her father's, because her father had left when she was 6, and her mother had seen no reason to keep his name around once he was gone, was 28 years old, newly non-married, employed by a man of ambiguous legal standing, and sitting in a house that felt like a held breath. She thought, this is either the worst decision I've ever made, or the first real one. Then she opened the folder to the second set of documents, the accounts, and went to work. Kelner ran 3 things as far as she could determine in the first 2 weeks. There was the legitimate side, a property development company that was genuinely profitable and genuinely boring, and 2 hospitality businesses that operated clean. Then there was the layer underneath, which was what it was, and she didn't ask him to explain it in terms that would require her to make a moral decision about it. She just made sure the numbers were correct, and the money moved where it was supposed to move, and nothing could be traced back to anything it shouldn't. He was not an easy man to work for, but he was a fair one. That surprised her. He left notes, actual handwritten notes, on paper, which she found unusual. Most of the men she'd worked for in the past communicated in terse emails or, worse, called meetings to say things that could have been a sentence. Kelner's notes were spare and specific. The Hartwell account is flagged as closed. It isn't. Find where the remainder went. Or, don't touch the column marked OV. That's not ours. She found where the Hartwell remainder went. She reported it to him. He thanked her in the same way he did most things, briefly, without performance, in a way that managed to convey that he actually meant it. She didn't ask what happened to the person who had moved the Hartwell remainder. Some questions were like that door in the hall behind the kitchen, closed, and with good reason. She settled into a rhythm. She was good at rhythms. She woke early. She ran the morning figures. She flagged anything that needed attention. She ate lunch at her desk because she liked her desk. She dealt with whatever Kelner's lieutenants had managed to confuse in the meanwhile, and she went to bed at a reasonable hour. She did not think about Ethan. She had decided, early on, that thinking about Ethan was a form of arithmetic she was no longer required to do. What she did think about sometimes was the man who had found her in the hallway, not in any way she was particularly comfortable admitting. It was more clinical than that, or she told herself it was. He was a study in contradiction, and she'd always been drawn to things that didn't balance on first inspection. He was meticulous but not cruel. He was powerful in the specific way that people are powerful when they've earned it the hard way, which meant he wore it differently than the men she'd known who'd been born into it. Looser, less performative, more like a coat he'd learned not to take off in dangerous weather. He looked tired, not sleepy tired, but the deeper kind, the kind that doesn't go away with rest. She recognized it because she had it too. 3 months in, she found the discrepancy. It was small, almost insultingly small for what it implied. A pattern of small transfers, each one unremarkable on its own, totaling over the course of 14 months to something that was not small at all. The kind of thing that required access and patience and a very precise understanding of where Kelner was and wasn't looking. She sat with it for a long time, long enough that it was dark outside before she looked up. Then she printed the documentation, put it in a folder, walked down the hallway to the room Kelner used as an office, and knocked. "Come in." He was standing at the window. He turned when she entered, read her face. He was very good at reading faces, she'd noticed, in the way that people are when they've survived long enough by doing it, and held out his hand for the folder without asking what it contained. He read it. She watched him. He didn't get angry. That was the thing about him she'd come to understand by now. The anger was there. She could see the temperature change in his expression, but it didn't become anything external. He just read, and then he looked up and said, "How long have you known? I found it 2 hours ago. Not before, not before." She met his eyes. "If I'd found it before, I would have told you before." He studied her. "You could have said nothing. That's not what we agreed to." "No." He closed the folder. "It isn't." She waited. He turned back to the window, and she saw something move across his reflection in the glass. Not quite what she'd have called relief, but something in that neighborhood, like a man who had been waiting to find out something and now knew. "Wren, yeah, I would like you to stay past the year." She hadn't expected that. She'd been keeping track of the days in the small, automatic way she kept track of everything. There were 4 months left on the contract. She had been, quietly, beginning to think about what came after. "Why?" she asked. He turned from the window. "Because you came to me with this, instead of using it. I told you I would. People say a lot of things." He set the folder on the desk. "You're the first one who's been right." She thought about the exit clause, the clean line she'd insisted on, that he'd agreed to without negotiation. She thought about the way this house had started, in the last 3 months, to feel less like a held breath and more like a place where she could leave her coffee cup on the windowsill and come back, and it would still be there. She thought about the note he'd left on her desk 2 weeks ago that said only, "Good catch on the Moreno duplicate." She'd kept it. She didn't examine why. What would the new terms be, she said. Something crossed his face that she was almost certain was the closest thing he had to a smile. "Whatever you say they are." Ethan found her 4 months after the wedding that wasn't. She was at the bakery 2 blocks from the Kelner property, the one that opened at 6:30 and made a specific kind of almond croissant that she had, with minimal guilt, built her entire morning routine around. She was standing at the counter waiting for her order when she felt someone behind her and turned, and there he was. He looked the same. That was the strangest part. She'd somehow expected him to be visibly different, diminished maybe or guilty in some way you could see, but he just looked like Ethan, a little tired, wearing the coat she'd helped him pick out 2 Januaries ago. "Wren," he said. She looked at him the way she'd look at a figure that had come in wrong, carefully, without feeling. "Ethan, I've been looking for you." "I know." She'd known for 2 months. Kelner's people had mentioned it, not as a warning, just as information, the way they communicated everything. "I need to explain." "You don't," she said. "Wren, what you must think, I think," she said, "that you moved money through 2 shell accounts for 18 months, and used it to fund a relationship you'd been in for at least that long, and probably longer. And the reason you wanted me to manage your books was specifically because you thought I wouldn't look too closely, because I loved you." She picked up her croissant bag from the counter. I looked closely. He stared at her. "The woman," she said. "Is it serious?" He blinked. Yes. I think so. Good." She meant it, and the fact that she meant it told her something useful about herself. Then that worked out. She walked past him. He didn't stop her. She got to the door and he said, "Where have you been? Who are you?" He stopped himself. "You look different." She thought about the third-floor room with the deadbolts and the window seat. She thought about the coffee on the windowsill. She thought about a man who left handwritten notes and read her face before she'd said a word, and had, in 14 months, never once asked her to be less than she was. "I'm good with numbers," she said. "I found better ones." She told Kelner about it that night. They were in the kitchen. This happened sometimes, late evenings, after the day had settled, and he was at the counter with a glass of something dark, and she was at the table with her laptop, and the remains of a dinner she'd made because Orina had the night off, and she'd decided she was tired of takeout. She told him about the bakery, about Ethan's face, about what she'd said. He listened the way he always did, fully, without interrupting, like he'd decided the moment she started talking that this was the only thing happening. When she finished, he said, "How do you feel?" "Honestly." She closed the laptop. "Like I balanced a ledger that had been wrong for 4 years. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, "He was an idiot." She laughed. It came out fuller than the one in the hotel hallway had. "Yeah," she said, "he was." Kelner set down his glass. He came to the table and sat across from her, and this was unusual. He didn't usually sit. He stood at windows or stood at counters, like a man who'd forgotten furniture was an option. She noticed she was very aware of the specific quality of silence in the room. "The year ends in 3 weeks," he said. "I know. You didn't answer me. About staying." She'd been thinking about it. She'd been thinking about it in the way she thought about everything important. Methodically, from multiple angles, running the figures until the answer was the one that fit. The math was not complicated. She knew what the numbers said. "I have a condition," she said. "You always do. The exit clause stays, permanently. I'm not removing it. I wouldn't ask you to, and if I find something wrong," she said, "I tell you, always, even if it's something you don't want to hear." He looked at her steadily. "I know that about you. I want to make sure you still want it when I'm not planning to leave." A pause, then, "I do." She nodded, opened her laptop again, looked at the screen, didn't see it. "Okay," she said, "I'm staying." She felt him exhale. It was slight, barely audible, but she caught it, the way she caught things that didn't announce themselves. A small, real thing in a house full of people who had learned to keep those to a minimum. She didn't look up, but she was smiling, and she let herself. Some ledgers, she had learned, take a long time to balance, and some debts turn out not to be debts at all. Just the long, slow record of what you're owed, waiting for someone honest enough to read it.